Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and I'm really sorry today because of the technical glitch that we could not live stream on YouTube. So we thought maybe it's a good idea to bring all of you through a Zoom platform. So it would be a big help if you can continue to close your cameras and also keep yourselves mute as the speaker of today speaks. So we have a late start, but we will try to, go through the, talk and also have some questions and answers. Um, I'm at the University of Waterloo and also representing the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership on Small Scale Fisheries here. So I would do 3 rounds of introduction, one to the V2B Global Partnership first, and then I will introduce the V2B webinar series that we have gathered here today for, and then I will introduce our speaker today before we start to hear the talk. So the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research knowledge action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to conduct transdisciplinary research, also to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand and deliberate on vulnerability to viability is not just in an economic sense, but also to include all aspects of human lives that pertains to the political, the cultural, the economics, of course, and the social and other aspects, psychological and other aspects. So our focus is fourfold. We are interested in the types of knowledge that is crucial to make this transition from vulnerability to viability possible, and we are particularly interested in the co-creation and co-production of the knowledge at all levels. Second, our interest is to create a repository or a database to hold this knowledge in a way that this can be used by multiple stakeholders and partners. Third is our interest in the variety of capacities that are required across, again, on all levels as crucial elements of B2B transitions. And the fourth is our interest in synthesizing and integrating all of that co-produced knowledge in a way that facilitates the transition from vulnerability to viability through creating novel governance and policy arrangements. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors, conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change processes and their impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday every month, and it will be during the entire year of 2023. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube, and today is an exception. I already know that because of the glitch. Details regarding the monthly webinars, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to the webinar platform is available on our webpage, that is www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the fourth in the series of V2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2023, and the 28th since January 2021 when it all started. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Anuradha Choudry as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Choudry is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur. She's also an outreach coordinator at the Indian Knowledge System Division in the Ministry of Education, Government of India in New Delhi. Her interest and scholarly engagements have primarily been in the domains of Sanskrit, yoga, Indian yoga philosophy, Indic approach to development, Indic concepts of happiness, and Indian culture and philosophy. She has worked on the Indian concepts of happiness as a fellow at the Development Foundation in Bangalore and established the Center for Indian Psychology at Jain University in Bangalore as well, which sought to establish an alternative paradigm for psychology based on the Indic worldview. And she will talk a lot more about all these worldviews and perspectives today. Dr. Choudry's research explores the contributions of Indian thoughts in the fields of psychology, development, happiness studies, linguistics, and other related socio-cultural dimensions. In doing so, her objective is to try and identify salient features of the Indic worldviews that offer an alternative perspective and discourse to the prevalent and sometimes dominant Euro-American narrative in many of these domains. An accomplished author and recipient of several awards and recognitions, Dr. Choudry is also a research partner of V2B Global Partnership, and we are very proud of that fact here. It is my honor today to invite Dr. Anuradha Choudry to deliver today's talk for the V2B thematic webinar series, April 2023, and her talk is titled, as you already know, as Vulnerability to Viability, Mind Matters. Over to you, Anuradha. Thank you for doing this. We're looking forward to your talk.
Namaste, and thank you very much, Professor Pradeep Naik, for this opportunity, for inviting me to share a few insights from the Indian culture, some perspectives on this whole discourse on vulnerability to viability. And I'll try my best to do justice to the topic. This topic in itself has been primarily to do with the fisheries, the fishers and the entire fisheries domain in different parts of the world. I have little expertise in that. I admit that in the beginning, but because at the basis of all activities, we have the mother disciplines such as psychology and philosophy. I think that irrespective of the circumstances in which we we act and we choose our specific domains of study, we cannot ever ignore the important role that psychology would play, and as well as philosophy, the worldview would play in determining the manners in which we deal with the different realities we face. So saying this, thank you once more to you and to the entire V2B team. I also would like to thank Professor Jinya Mukherjee from the IIT Kharagpur, who's been an incredible support and gives me these opportunities to stretch my boundaries of interest and see how the application of the specific areas that I work with can find meaning in different contexts. So I would just like to start by sharing my screen here. One second, just. Yes. Can you see my screen? Yes. So the subject that we have is from vulnerability to viability and mind matters, as you mentioned. So just before we start, I would like everybody to just visualize when we use the word vulnerability and viability. I would just like you to, for a moment, take stock of when you say vulnerability, what is the image that you form in your mind, and what are some words that you would associate with it? So the entire process of psychology is also understanding the relationship between the right brain and the left brain, where on one side with the left brain we use words, and on the right brain we create images. And directly or indirectly, the way we visualize realities impacts the way in which we then deal with realities, not just as researchers, not just as people who are experiencing that reality, but also as researchers. So when we go to the field, the way we are looking at reality, the way we understand the circumstances of the fishers, etc., will determine how we engage with them and make a difference in their, their experience of their vulnerable positions, etc. So I'd just like you to, for a moment, just think of the word vulnerability and just mark in your mind 2, 3 words that would strike you around that. And then to look at viability and also think of what would viability look like for you in your mind's eye. So if you can just take maybe 2 minutes to do that, or just a minute possibly. I will then move on to the next slide, which, as you can see here, is this whole question of that. And the first slide, as we had a net being cast, I try to play on that. So I said, the net is and are being cast all the time. Who gets caught, who escapes? What determines the difference between who gets caught and who escapes? And in this entire possibilities, in the range of possibilities, does the mind really matter? So I've made an acronym here of NET in this context, which is natural environmental turmoils. So as in one of his talks, Pradeep was saying that, flux, volatility, change is inevitable. So that's the only reality that we are all living with, as Buddha famously said, that the only certainty is the uncertainty and change that is going to happen. So how are we negotiating these changes? And what are those factors that allow us to adapt to the changing circumstances so that we always stay in the zone of viability rather than vulnerability? And as you also mentioned, Pradeepji, that viability, from vulnerability to viability, the movement is really going from being in disadvantaged positions because of circumstances externally, because of different factors that are there in the external circumstances primarily, and then moving on to a more viable option. And that viability is often determined by the quantum of resilience that is there in the individual, as Derek had also mentioned in one of his talks. So we look at how the quantum of resilience that is there in an individual is directly proportionate to the way in which one is able to adapt to the different volatile situations in which one is living today, especially in a world that is a VUCA world where there is just so much of change happening constantly. So I'll try and make this session of ours experiential, engaging, and enriching. And at the same time, I was hoping to make this a little dimensionally different and disruptive in possible ways that you have considered the subject of vulnerability and viability. And in this context, I would like to, because I mentioned that I'll make this session experiential for you. So I'd like to start by asking you to just observe your hand, because one of the things that we see here is that there is a certain relationship between the words, as I said, and the realities that we create. So before we go on to the exercise, I would just like to get to the etymology of the terms. And we see that here the term vulnerable from Latin comes from the word vulnus, which means wound. And in Sanskrit, because that's the language that I normally deal in, and I try and always see if I can find a translation to make it more comprehensible for me. So the Sanskrit word is vedhaniya, which means woundable or pierceable. So it means that the extent to which one can be wounded or one can be hurt is directly proportionate to how vulnerable one would be in different circumstances. And the word viable comes from the French viable, or it implies capable of life, from vi, or life, from the Latin vita, and life from the Proto-Indo-European root, which is guay, or to live, and add able to that. So basically, viability means it is the capacity for life. So we see these two words that are very interestingly positioned. On one side, you have wounding, and wounding which in its extreme position would lead to death. And on the other side, you have this the survival, the inherent drive for survival, which is the capacity for life, and how do we navigate this range from being wounded to being trying to keep life existing, to keep aspiring for greater life. So this is what will determine how we move from vulnerability to viability. Now, there are a few fundamental questions that are important here, and understanding the relationship between these fundamental questions plays an important role in determining how an individual is capable of making this transition from vulnerability to viability effectively or not. It depends entirely on how one perceives reality, which is the ontology of any given circumstance. So there is a reality, then there is a perception of that reality. There is a perception and there is a knowledge component. So even if there is knowledge, how do we interpret that knowledge is what we can define perception as. So how do we interpret the knowledge that is there in order to make that then useful for action? So we have this, and then that action is how do we deal effectively with that reality. So we have the nature of reality on one side, which is ontology. We have knowledge and perception of reality on the other side, which is epistemology. And then you have the effective dealing with reality, which is the praxis. And each of these is interconnected in different ways, as you can see with the arrows here. So the first important thing when we're looking at it from a psychological perspective is to understand this whole phenomenon of perception. So I would, in this context, invite you to do that exercise that I had mentioned a little earlier on. And I'd like you all to observe your hand and tell me, and not tell me, but again, if you'd like to maybe note down on chat, that's a possibility, but observe your hand and see what is it that you would notice. So very typically, and I'd like you to follow this example, because then you will be able to appreciate this particular worldview of the Indic approach that I will try and share with you. So when you're looking at your hand, a few things that become visible is that you see the lines, so you see color, you see texture, you see all of that. Now imagine, for whatever reason, if you had to have, let's say an X-ray lens in front of your eyes, what would happen? So I imagine that you will say that you're seeing bones, right? So now if you're looking at your hand with bones, will you at that point think of wearing some colorful, will you think of putting henna or this mehndi or design on your hands? These are things that you would not do, because the reality that you're perceiving through an X-ray lens is very different from the reality that you're perceiving normally. So what has happened here is that the object is the same, but our perception of that reality has changed. And the reality itself has undergone a dimensional shift. So the hand as we know it ordinarily is no longer the same identical hand when you're looking at it through a different lens. Okay. And therefore, when you're changing the way you're perceiving it, the manner in which you're going to interact with it is going to be different. Because when you're looking at your hand through an X-ray lens, if you're going to lift up something which is very heavy, you would not do it in the same manner as you would do it when you are, when you are just lifting it, when you can't see the bones. Similarly, when you have another, let's say if you put in another lens and you're looking at your hand through, maybe, you're looking at your hand through an infrared lens, which will show you the heat patterns. So you'll see colors, you'll see blues and yellows and greens and reds. And again, when you are approaching a heated object, you would do it very differently if you could see the heat, a quantum of heat in that, versus, when you can't see that, etc. So again, perceptions are changing, our understanding of reality changes, our dealing with that reality changes. And this is in this context of the hand, but otherwise, the same analogy or the same exercise can be applied on everything else that we live in the world that we live in. Taking it a little further, if you have, let's say now, maybe a very powerful microscope, you're going to be noticing that there are these germs and microbes and cellular formations. You take a quantum lens, you go much deeper, and suddenly you will see that everything is particles, everything is, there is this fuzzy energy stuff that is there. So if we have at that level of perception, supposing for some reason a person gets stuck with that kind of a lens, the way they are going to be looking at the hand is going to be very, very different in the way. In fact, at that level, there is no hand to be seen because everything, it merges with the rest of reality, it merges with everything. So the only experience that one has, if you close your eyes and for a moment allow yourself to go into this quantum reality of perception, you'll see that the only apparently truth that you can experience is this fuzziness of energy all over, this vibrating fuzziness of energy everywhere. And therefore, at some level, we are composed of these fuzzy vibratory stuff as well. But depends, excuse me, depends on how we are perceiving reality. And if at that level of reality, supposing we are looking at the world through a quantum lens, if one asks the question, where does nature begin? Where does man begin? I mean, where does the individual begin? We see that there are no strict boundaries like we would normally look at it. So that is one alternative reality. That is an alternative parallel reality that is there. And depending on where we are plugging ourselves, we will have a certain experience of that reality. Now, this might be on one side sounding very philosophical and a bit, removed from what we are talking about. But because the focus of of the talk today is not so much about the material reality alone, but the subtle mind stuff that plays a key role in determining how we are understanding the nature of the gross world that we exist in. The material and the non-material coming together from a very different perspective through this lens. And therefore, if one has to understand that the questions that one would ask, very important questions that one would ask in this context is, who therefore are we as human beings? What is our potential as human beings? And what is our relationship with this nature that we live in? And to what extent are we influencing nature that we live in? So if we zoom back into our grosser material body, then there is this very strong duality and dichotomy between this person as an individual and the nature of reality and environment as such. And apparently, the only impact that I have with nature is when I'm doing something to nature, etc. But the moment one realizes that actually our coexistence with our environment is happening at multiple layers simultaneously, from the gross physical all the way up to the subtle vibrational level, then our dealing with the environment changes substantially. When we are existing in the range of the gross physical, then the duality with the physical world and doing something with it changes. But when we are living, when we can look at ourselves from a different dimension of who we think we are, then how we engage and how we react to external circumstances can be changed significantly. So I would like to share with you an idea that we had, that I talk of when this is a framework of happiness that is based on the Sanskrit term sukha, which means, it normally means happiness, but it can also be broken up into two sounds, which are su and kha. Su, which means excellent, space, excellent, and kha means space. So one can look at our experience also in terms of coexisting dynamic spaces. So that's another way of considering the relationship that we have with the world around us. In this context, what happens is that the question that arises is that what is the maximum or what is the best way in which one can deal with this space? So there are largely two kinds of spaces. There is an external space and there is an internal space. Now, we'll have to, in the following slides, we will see what is the relationship between these two spaces that will then determine whether one is a vulnerable individual from the perspective of spaces, or whether one is one moves towards viability in terms of how one is engaging with those spaces. So if sukha or happiness is excellent space, dukkha is by contrast, bad space. then what does this excellent space mean? And we have here the external, which in Pradeep in one of his talks had talked of as the material. And then we have the interpersonal space. That's the relational space that we have between individuals and with nature, with all the world, the environment around us. And then we have the personal or the inside space, which is, or the internal space, which is the subjective space. And how do we deal with that? And what are the implications? What is the relationship between these two spaces, and how then do we deal with it is a question to be discussed. So here there are some space management possibilities. First question is that we have the external space is excellent and the internal space is excellent. This is an ideal situation. Case 2 is that the external situation is a bad space. The internal space is also a bad space, in which case vulnerability is very high and one becomes a victim of one's circumstances. So let's talk if you want to apply it in the case of the fishes and all. So we have various factors that determine their well-being, their happiness and their well-being. So you have different factors. They can be physical, they can be social, they can be financial, they can be environmental. All these are different factors of their environment that will determine that will influence the quality of their internal space. Now, if an individual is not watching their internal space, then the nature of the external space has a direct impact on the quality of the internal space. Now we have, for example, and vulnerability therefore increases, because if the external space is negative and bad, if it is threatening because of climatic conditions, because of financial challenges, because of social unease or unrest, then all of those factors will directly weaken the internal space quality, and therefore one becomes a victim of that circumstance. Let's look at the next scenario, which is the case 3, where we have an external space which is excellent, but the internal space is bad. Now, in this context, we would consider such individuals to be in a state of dis-ease, or a situation where they would possibly need to have more focus on their mental well-being, because irrespective of all the positive, excellent circumstances that they are in, the internal space is still bad, and therefore the only way that one can handle that is by focusing on understanding the different factors that are leading to this negative space generation within the individual. And also to understand, therefore, that even if the external space is good, what is it within the fishes, or what is it within that individual which is preventing them from appreciating it or experiencing well-being in that circumstances. Yeah. And therefore we have the final case study, which is of direct relevance to, of what we are talking about here. And that is, the external space is bad, but the internal space is excellent. Now, this becomes a very interesting possibility from a V2V perspective, because then we see that there is a great degree of viability. And just trying to put this together, I said, therefore, the conclusion is that viability is the result of the creation of positive internal space to the quantum of negative external space. And this is directly proportional. So the more positive internal space one can create with the quantum of negative internal space, the more viable the individual is in a given circumstances. And this, as we had seen in an earlier context, is directly also connected to how do we perceive reality. And that is where the mind becomes an important tool in determining this process from from vulnerability to viability. Now, depending on how we are perceiving the reality, so one was the nature of the reality, second one was our perception or our knowledge of it, and the third component is the action part of it. So in this case, we have 3 modes of action. The first mode of action is something that in Sanskrit is called kartum, or to act. So if something happens, we act, to act or to react in this context. So it is a reaction based on one's habitual or default modes of action. So in a typical circumstance, when there is in the context of, let's say, in the context of the Sundarbans, if there are floods that have happened and the population is affected, one can go through these three phases of reaction, of action against them. So the first one would be to react, where uh, the flood has happened, individuals, fishers, and other members of the community have lost their properties, they've lost everything, and they can become completely vulnerable. The more vulnerable one becomes, the more dependent one becomes on an external agency to come and provide rescue and aid. The second one is also to not to act, akartum, which is to submit. One becomes one can become completely submissive to the reaction, to the situation, and become a victim of the circumstance. And the third one is to act otherwise, or anyatha kartum, which means to respond. Now, when we spoke of reaction, there are two ways that one can react. To react is not negative, not necessarily a negative situation. Because let's say there is a flood in a particular area. There will be some people who will react negatively and get into depression and become victims of that circumstance. There are other individuals who will react positively and become leaders of the community in order to take proactive action and ensure that whatever damage has happened can be controlled. They can minimize the damage that further can take place and take positive action in order to support the community. This ability to either react, either become a victim or to respond, again, is not dependent on the external circumstances, because we see that the external circumstance is the same in both cases. But whether one will go from vulnerability to viability depends on the individual's constitution and how one is perceiving that reality and acting in that context. So viability in this context becomes the art of going from reaction, which is just based on one's default mechanisms, to responding to a situation. And when one is responding to the situation, then one is in a position of becoming an agent of positive change, and also doing things which will build resilience, not just for the individual, but also for the community. Because when the individual is able to display that degree of resilience, that also has a kind of a mirror effect. So these are certain discoveries that have been made in the world of psychology and neuroscience. Quite a few things are there in the world of neuroscience as well that are being and that are contributing quite meaningfully and effectively to the discourses of psychology. So there is this idea of the mirror neuron, that the way in which an individual is acting is directly triggering the same kind of neurons in the minds of the others. So if one individual is acting in a negative manner, then those who are observing them, the chances that they will react in the same victim mode is heightened. Whereas if one acts in a manner that is responsible and proactive, then there are chances that people who did not find hope in a circumstance will also start becoming more responsive and proactive in also finding creative solutions to the different problems that they are in. And therefore, mind is the gap, because one doesn't always necessarily understand how it functions. And perception management, it's become perception. So perception management becomes the key of the whole movement from vulnerability to viability. And it's in this context that one can have it depends on the kind of mind that one has. I'll see if I can at some point maybe just switch off from the PPT and then just do a whiteboard and maybe draw a few things for you. Again, this is just to help you understand it differently from an Indic perspective, that when we talk of dealing with reality and responding to it in different ways, there have been very detailed first person research that has gone into understanding the different qualities of mind and the impacts that they can have on the environment around them. So a mind can be either of the first kind, which is totally cluttered. So if a circumstance that happens is encountered by a mind that is cluttered like this, then their reactions to the circumstance will also be a cluttered reaction. There will not be clarity of thought. They will not be able to act in a manner that will allow them to see alternative possibilities. Or the mind space can be clean and well arranged. So the more organized the mind spaces, the mind, emotion, physical, the more organized the internal spaces, the more there are chances of dealing effectively with vulnerable situations. The more the more disorganized the internal spaces, which consists of the quality of the mind, the ability to focus, concentrate, peace of mind without too many disturbances. Whether that is there, or if it has there are also emotional disturbances that determine the quality of the internal space. So more internal disturbances there are. So, for example, if one is doing research and one goes to a particular site and there is a disaster that has struck and one has to act in that context, if one gets completely carried away and one is as vulnerable as the individual, then one would not be in a position to make any positive suggestions or help the individual in need. So it's only when, irrespective of the external circumstances, the inner circumstances, one can keep that inner circumstance and that inner space clean, will determine to what efficacy one is able to act in such a situation of natural environmental turmoil, or the net situation in one's environment. We also have another thing of, while on one side, of course, that the internal spaces also matter, the external spaces also can either be clean or they can be kept very cleanly. So the quality of the internal space and the relationship with the external space can be one of vulnerability to viability in terms of the individual's response to the circumstance. The more an individual moves from vulnerability to viability in the way they manage their perceptions, will determine to what effect they're able to reverse a negative external environment into a positive environment, which is also another way of looking at how crisis can be turned into an opportunity, depending on the way one is perceiving things, that perception being determined by the nature of the mind stuff, whether it is a disturbed mind, whether it is a quiet mind. All of this will play a direct role in ensuring the resilience levels of the individual, and that then determining how viable the individual can make their circumstance. And therefore, I will move into a particular example that we had. It was an inspiring story, but just certain factors around the viability of fishers and all that we see, and this is what we had talked about. So there can be this external circumstance of the human challenges. There are the physical challenges, there are natural, there are social, there are financial. So all these different factors are, in a sense, not in our control. And the word sukha is, the word for happiness as sukha, is quite insightful in the sense that if we say that only if the external circumstances are excellent, then one will experience excellence and well-being and happiness, one becomes completely dependent on the quality of the external space. And we go back to case 2, which is bad external space, bad internal space. Case 1 is excellent external space, and excellent internal space. So if the environment is excellent, I will feel excellent. Environment is bad, I will feel bad. That is when one believes that the external spaces play an important role in qualifying the internal space. But if we accept that the whole phenomenon of happiness and well-being is actually determined by the quality of the internal space, which is again where the role of the mind becomes crucial, we at the same time acknowledge that happiness and well-being becomes a personal responsibility. So how are we going to ensure one's internal space, the quality of one's internal space becomes very, very important. I will just share with you this example of Jamuna Sardar. We met her in the Sundarbans this time in this village where we are doing a project called Kumir Mari. And she is a very special case of this Sukha tale. So she shared her story where there was this instance of, she's part of a women's self-help group. And as part of different projects, we are trying to see how we can also involve these women self-help groups to become active, proactive members of change, proactive leaders of change in their communities. So she shared with us, I mean, there was a little bit of skepticism initially, because she said that, there are many organizations that come and they give us a lot of hope. They teach us certain skills, and they tell us that they are going to help us improve our livelihood options by helping us market the products of the skills that we have learned, etc. So there was one team that came and taught them about waste management and natural compost generation from the waste that they have. And they said that we will find markets for you to be able to sell these products. So she says, and unfortunately, they did not come back after that. Now, there is a very interesting psychological phenomenon that happens, and that's called learned helplessness by Martin Seligman. I mean, he's the one who did a lot of research on it, and he's the same person who also worked on positive psychology later on. So it's very interesting. So when he was working with certain animals, he found that with the dog, if you keep a dog in a cage and starve the dog, keep food outside, and the dog tries to get to the food, you have you have a place where it gets a shock. There's an electric fence there, and it gets a shock, so it recoils. After a while, it's hungry, so it'll try and get the food again. Again, it gets a shock and it recoils. Third time, it will try doing it and it recoils because of the shock. And then they saw that this dog no longer tries to reach out for the food, no matter how hungry it is. Now, what is interesting is that this phenomenon of learned helplessness is a potential reality in a lot of these vulnerable zones, because they experience these continuous the disasters that are arising from different climatic change, especially with the fishes, with the rising sea waters, the increasing number of storms, floods, all of that. So they are continuously being exposed to all of these things. Now the question is that what is it in their philosophy or in their psychology that allows them to withstand these shocks is a question. So they can either become, in the context of learned helplessness, they can allow themselves to become a victim, or like in the case of Jamuna, what she did was because when we went to them and said, we have another idea for you, the first response was that of learned helplessness. They said, see, we've had, so many people coming to us and we still have this challenge. And then we said that, give us another try, because we are genuine in our efforts to make positive change. So then she said that during the when she realized that all those she had created a lot of compost, she had created a lot of those natural manure and the natural what do you say, fertilizers. She says that when I had all of that, the only thing sorry all right. So she says that the only thing, she says that they could not take further interest in the matter of organic manure produced for the market sale. So I decided upon the alternative options and used the same in my own vegetable farms, and was benefited with greater quantity and better quality of vegetable produce. Even in my rice production increased by 8 to 9 bags more than my co-workers. I feel benefited greatly, because after repeated hits of cyclones, increased quantity and good quality produce remained a mere possibility due to the increased salinity of soil. Since then, I advise and train to make use the homemade organic manure for the awareness purpose and to envision a better future. So what she basically did is she put all that into her field, and even when the storm of when Ayla, the cyclone, hit, and all her neighboring farms were affected badly by salinity, she says that within a year her farm was able to recoup from the negative effects, because of the fact that she had already put those natural manure into the soil. So we see that she could have there were many other ladies in that self-help group, and who did not, who rather became a victim of the circumstances. They said that there is nobody from outside who's come to help us. They said they would help us. So they had completely outsourced their agency to another organization. But in her case, because she realized that because there was the ability to think positively and proactively instead of reacting and becoming a victim, she decided to respond to the situation because of her way of looking at things, she was able to positively turn around her story. And then with one such story, she became an inspiration for the others to follow also. So we see that at the end of the day, this whole concept of sukha, or this movement from vulnerability to viability, if you're looking at it through the lens of spaces, if you're looking at it through the lens of how the mind can be cultivated in order to experience positive spaces within the individual, which then allow us to perceive reality as it is rather than through the filters of our negative experiences. When that kind of a self architecture takes place, that will then move on to the idea of a self leadership. So the big question that is, how do we plan, how do we design, how do we execute and maintain our inner and outer spaces for excellence? And how do we co-manage our multiple multi-layered spaces? The more effectively one is able to integrate all of those, the more effectively one is able to act in the different vulnerable situations of the external spaces. So there is just one other important idea that I would like to share before I close here, is the fact that the whole idea of karma is that action is inevitable. And when the mind is like water, when it is turbulent, it's difficult to see. But when it's calm, everything becomes clear. And with that clarity comes a certain coherence of being. That coherence allows the possibility of understanding shared goals, shared meaning, reduced internal tensions, complementary functions, conserved energy, etc. The final idea that I would like to share with you is that in any given circumstance, we we have come to acknowledge that the way we perceive it will determine how we are responding. There is an idea in the Indic tradition called the concept of dharma, which says that there is first, in any given circumstances, one has to be able to conceive of what is the best options that are available. The more one is able to conceive these best options, that will then lead to the ability to execute. So between the conception of the ideal and the execution of the ideal, if the lesser the gap there is, the more clarity there is in the minds of the people, the more they are able to anticipate a negative situation and prepare for that well in advance, which will increase the chances of viability. And finally, the more they're able to adapt to that situation, that will lead to a greater degree of happiness and well-being. Thank you.
Anu, really, really, wonderful. I mean, listening to your talk is almost like going through a cleansing process of thinking about vulnerability and viability from a very different perspective and lenses. And there's a lot. So what we are requesting our participants today is to still stay behind your cameras and keep yourself mute. Please write any questions that you may have, so I will read it out to our speaker today. Okay, maybe in the meantime, I will ask a quick question, Anu. Really wonderful, formulation of this internal and external exchanges and vulnerability, and make an effort to move towards viability. And in doing so, a lot of focus was on the tension between these external forces and the internal forces. And to my understanding, you were all saying the internal needs to be more powerful and consistent and be sane in many ways to be able to stay within the viability zone. So can you discuss a little bit more about that tension between the external and the internal, and who is really powerful? So can we achieve viability by just keeping our internal self powerful, or we also need to work on the external factors?
It's a very, very valid question and a very important one. And there are two ways of looking at this. So one is to understand that the internal and external are symbiotically related. So you cannot, they will in any case influence each other. The second thing to be, and therefore, the question that is the moot question that is there is, which one will overpower the other? And to what extent do we have the capacity or the power to ensure that irrespective of the external circumstance, the internal will be powerful and will be able to override whatever happens externally. So now in this context, what they talk of from an Indic perspective is that, and this is where the entire practice of yoga becomes so important, because the whole process of yoga is the process of aligning the mind stuff with the emotional stuff with the internal stuff, because it's also helpful to understand that the internal space is not a quiet space. The internal space is a very full space. It is a very full space due to various factors. It is a full space. So I mean, I normally do this example of the room, and that's why there was that that those images were there. The internal space, if you look at it like a room, is qualified. The quality of the internal space is determined.
Yeah, that's really,
Trying to
contextual,
remove
because,
your
we're talking
people.
about
I'm
the
very
internal and the
Sorry.
external, okay?
No, I know. So here there is this external space and there is an internal space. So I think no matter what the external space is, if we can just focus on the quality, and this is a good example also, because what we see here is that the external noises will be there. Now, what will determine whether one, in this context, let's just take the instance of what is happening on Zoom right now. So there is external noise. So there are people who want to create disturbances. That is always there. What is it that Seville is doing that is not allowing that to disturb the internals, the noise of the internal space, is by muting or removing. So the individual has different senses. The senses act like these doorways that allow it to come in. Now, if the individual is watchful of what those senses are giving to and how one is reacting to those senses or responding to those senses, will determine whether one is being able to fight the circumstance positively or succumb to it. There is this very good article. Again, this is on neuroscience, and this is something that I wanted to point out. I'm forgetting the name of that particular scientist. It's somebody called Yuri. He talks on neural resonance. So he says that the first words that you hear of a story will play a very important role in determining how you're going to be reacting to that story. And therefore, if somebody says, that this person is a great person, the way we will interact with that individual is very different than if somebody says this person is is an incompetent person. Will determine. Similarly, if we, and in this context, like if we, as researchers, if you go to a certain environment and you talk to I mean, this is a bit the ethics of research from this perspective, this angle. If you're going to a community and say, oh, it's so sad, such a hard condition you have and all, then whatever they might have thought about, we've undone their capacity to deal with it, because we have added a colored lens for their perception of that reality. Instead, if as a researcher one is there and one talks of the possibilities that all of these circumstances offer, then even in a negative, even in a vulnerable situation, they will come out of it from a viable perspective, in a viable manner. So from a yogic perspective in India, we talk of the fact that irrespective of the negative circumstance, the quieter the internal noise is, the more, which is, and quieter by quieter also mean less biases, less carryovers of learned helplessness, less prejudices of how or who is coming to help us and what could be their motives. So many factors. So the less one is disturbed by them, the more present one will be to be able to recognize opportunities. And it is this ability to recognize opportunities irrespective of the difficulties, which will be the lifesaver for people who live in volatile zones. And that freedom of choice is exclusively in the hand of the individual. So if one understands sukha as internal spaces, I mean, excellent internal spaces, then it is exclusively the individual's responsibility. And the more one is able to perceive possibilities of viability in vulnerable situations, the more one will offer opportunities for transformation in the communities that are affected by external circumstances.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we have a question, Anu, from Amit Lahiri here at Waterloo. Amit says, Professor Choudry, thank you for the super framework and presentation. His question is, what could be the role of the researcher translating the ontological to an epistemological relation in a research project to influence the empowered action for the potential victims in a given vulnerable environment? Sorry for the long question. Okay.
No. It's a brilliant question here. So you're saying translating the ontological. Okay. So there was a very interesting experience that we had during one of our group discussions, focus group discussions in the Sundarbans. So one of the problems that are faced by the fishers, one of the reasons why we are engaging in projects in those regions of the Sundarbans is because one of the major challenges that they face is every time they go to fish or catch crab in the forest, they are threatened with death. I mean, every time they go there, they really don't know whether they're going to be coming back alive because of the threat of tigers, many other challenges that they face when they go into the forest. So as a researcher, in this case, it's the opposite case. So as a researcher, we would, one of the logical questions was therefore, should we kill all the tigers in the forest? I mean, should we remove the tigers? Should we, should the tigers be removed? And without killing them, because that will be an environmental disaster. But should we remove the tigers from the forest was a question. Would that, give you security in terms of going and doing the, for your livelihood options? And very interestingly, that individual said that don't remove the tigers. He says, if you remove the tigers, the jungles will be gone. So in this case, it's a reverse case that as a researcher, we went in with a certain ontology, a certain understanding of the relationship between the fishers, the community, the Sundarban population, and the wildlife there with the tigers. And we came back instructed about the fact that no, actually, there is a way in which they're dealing with it, which is not the best, but they do not want the tigers to be removed because there is a larger good that is affected by, if that particular creature is removed. Now, the question that was also there is how can we help them understand? So one is, of course, if we go and present to them. So let's say, let me tell you another case study of our experience in Kumirmari. The fishers were dealing with the fish in a particular manner in this inland fishing. So we started engaging with them, and we said, let's build a pond and let's do it from a very research perspective. Now, the thing is that they had a certain way of looking at how the fish had to be introduced, what food had to be given, etc. What we did is that we brought in experts from the fisheries, from SIFRI, and he was able to widen their understanding of the relationship of the fish with the feed, with the timing of putting in the feed. So from a very practical research point of view, the involvement of the researcher by bringing in a larger perspective of the different aspects, the different components of the livelihood options of the fishers, allowed them to then change their method of, doing the fishing, inland fishing. And they were very grateful because they said, and that was a sense of empowerment they got. They said that earlier on, we did not understand, what they did not understand, they did not see the relationship between it. And like, just to emphasize on what I was saying here, they said, for example, putting chalk or tuna for the fish is a regular practice in these villages for inland fishery ponds. So what they did is that they were putting it at any time in the afternoon, etc. This expert, Anjan Babu, he says that if you put it during the day, it can turn toxic and become negative. I mean, it can harm the fish. He said instead you have to put it at night, you have to wet it and allow that to, cool down and acquire a different property. In the morning, before the sun rises, you have to put it in. That's when the fish and the pond are benefited maximum by this intervention. Now, what we did as a researcher was help them understand the relationship between all of this, which was an increasing of the scope of their ontology of sorts. The second one was empowering them with the understanding, and therefore their appreciation of the reason, and because they understood the logic, they were able to implement it more effectively. Consequence was that there is a better chances of the fish having better growth, etc. So I hope it was a very long answer, a bit roundabout from different perspectives, but I hope that it answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, he says thank you to you. So we'll take one more question maybe before we bring it to an end. I know we're going a little bit over time because we started, quite late, and with all the disturbances in the process, an interesting challenge to the internal and the external. And thanks for using that as an example here, but not a nice experience. Where would you like to position volatility when discussing from vulnerability to viability? Any insights from the net idea? This is from Jain Mukherjee.
So natural environmental turmoil or turbulence, this is to be expected. I mean, we know by having violated all the 9 planetary boundaries, and nobody know. I mean, she knows it best of all, that once we have disrupted all of that, it will also call for a disruptive mechanism of response. We cannot go by the usual conventional responses to these situations, because the magnitude of change is requiring a very innovative format of responding to them. So what is important here is to understand that, and this is an interesting point actually. One is, of course, the whole question of equilibrium. There are equilibriums externally, there are equilibriums internally. When external equilibriums are constantly in flux because there are many uncontrollable variables, as we just saw, that can change the quality of the environment externally, which is the whole question of volatility. The volatility is nothing but this uncontrollable variable, which is uncontrolled variable that will keep changing the dynamics of an environment of equilibrium. Now, how we can deal with that is, one, if we understand the nature of that, what is equilibrium really, to understand how as individuals we can contribute to that externally by acting in certain methods, by using certain external tools, by intervening in whichever way is required. Because equilibrium is not a homogeneous concept. It's there at multiple levels. And therefore, the more one is able to reduce volatility within the individual, and that is what I would like to possibly bring in as a twist in this entire thing, is that the more involatile or non-volatile the internal is, the more effectively one will handle the external volatility. So if the internal is also volatile and the external is volatile, then we've got amplification of volatility. So internal remains non-volatile, then there is a greater chances of restoring balance or equilibrium in a volatile environment of net.
Yeah, I know, deep meanings, and a wonderful way to kind of look at how there's a lot in our hands. There's a lot in the internal. Because we try to kind of launch at and respond to the externalities, thinking that the internal is already preserved, or internal is already strong. But it is not. So the work starts with internal mostly. We have one more question, but I will just read the question, and I'm really aware of people's other commitments, so I'll read the question, and maybe you can do a response through email or something. I'll provide the email to Aliou Shal from Senegal. And Ali is asking, Professor Choudry, as you are from a country where religion represents an important role in people's daily lives, don't you think that those kind of beliefs can impact on how fishers represent themselves or their vulnerabilities? And then Ali is also asking about fatalism and eco-fatalism or something like that. But if you can respond less than 1 minute, and I'm not trying to put a
No, no,
restriction
go
on
ahead.
you, but I want to formally bring it to an end, so that people can go there, to their other commitments. Okay,
Sure,
just
sure.
a quick
No,
cut.
very quickly. There is in our country, there is this strong idea of a karma theory, which is, saying that there are reasons why we experience certain, go through certain experiences in a present situation which are inexplicable. Uh, and therefore, we are, in that sense, a little fatalism, that the idea of fatalism can be brought in. That we resign to a certain fate because of uh, possibly certain things that have happened in wherever, however far back in the past. But the very idea of karma also tells us that while the past is affecting the present, in the present, what you do to it will determine your future. So the idea of karma from a, let's say, the Sanatana Dharma or the Vedic perspective is also reinforcing the need for positive action at this moment, because that is going to be determining the future thing. And I will just share with you how the idea of this karma in certain contexts has been very positive in our community. For example, when the tsunami had struck, the psychologists had gone along the coast of the country, the southern coast, to find out what were the disastrous consequences on the communities and their psychology and well-being. And what they found is that the people were able to rebound back to normalcy very, very quickly. And one of the factors that they attributed it was precisely the theory of karma. They said that since people believe that what has happened is something that the universe has sent our way, and therefore we cannot. There's nothing else that we can do about it. But let's accept it and let's build on to this, instead of sitting and becoming a victim of the situation, that, oh my god, I have nothing to do, I've lost everything and all. They said, if God has given us the strength, if God has brought this our way, they've also given us the strength to fight this out and come out of this circumstance. And in all these villages that we go to, we find that the presence of certain religious rituals and storytelling practices are very, very prevalent. And therefore, this connection with a force that will ensure their well-being, and that even in difficult circumstances is acts as a source, a pillar of strength. When, as a human being, I feel that my own capacity is insufficient to handle the enormity of the disaster, then I align myself with the connection of a higher force that knows why this has happened and will give me the force to overcome it. So religion in this country plays a very important role to bring to strengthen resilience in various contexts. And that religion, it's not just the Hindus. We find this religious mind also in different communities. But it's the faith that there is a higher power that can help us on one side. And on the other side, the conviction that if karma from the past has led to this, my present action will lead to positive, can lead to positive, proactive action as well.
And that really matches with some of the things
That
that
was
we do.
59 seconds, Prateek.
Okay. Thank you very much. And that, that explanation matches so much with the complexity theory many of us work in. So respecting the unknown and really planning for the uncertainty and unpredictability elements around us is a powerful way to deal with your vulnerabilities, and may it come from religion, faith, and other kinds of sources, in different contexts. But to value that there are certain things that we do not know, the uncertain, the unpredictable, and then the complexity of things is a good way to kind of retain that inner self, and then the internal that we were talking about, and that becomes then the launching ground for dealing and responding with the externalities as they pose many challenges. So I would say that it's not only religion but many other aspects, and some of your work actually reflects those kind of intricate complex interactions that goes on in the physical world, but also in the metaphysical world itself. So really wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Choudry, for not only giving us new lens to think about vulnerability to viability, but also showing some directions in terms of our research pathways. So of course this discussion will continue, as we are all part of a network, but also we're looking forward to listening and hearing more on the same concepts and your ideas in future. So thank you once again. Thank you everyone for joining, and my apologies on behalf of the organizers for the unknown and the external that we don't have often much control on. But as long as Anuradha said, as long as we are strong internally, we are able to respond to them. And we'll make sure that those forces are not part of our platform and not part of our engagements in future. We'll do our best to that. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks once again, Dr.
Thank
Choudry.
you very much. And also thank you to Polumi for that picture of Yamuna. Thank you.